The summer sun blazed over the Hayes' sprawling suburban estate, its manicured lawn and sparkling pool a postcard of perfection. Inside the dining room, though, the air was thick with tension, heavier than the humidity pressing against the bay windows. The table was set for lunch, fine china, polished silver, a centerpiece of lilies that screamed money, but the meal felt like a battlefield. David Stone sat rigid, his calloused hands folded tightly in his lap, his jaw clenched like he was bracing for a mortar strike. Across from him, Richard and Catherine Hayes, his in-laws wielded words sharper than any blade he'd faced in Afghanistan. Richard, a barrel-chested man with a silver mane and a voice that boomed like a drill sergeant, leaned forward, his fork stabbing the air. "You're bleeding us dry, David," he said, eyes narrowing. "You and those kids, it's a bottomless pit." His tone carried the weight of a man used to boardrooms, not compassion. Catherine, draped in a silk blouse that probably cost more than David's old army pension, didn't look up from her plate but added her venom in a clipped, icy drawl. "We didn't sign up for this. You're not family, you're a liability." David's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. He'd heard worse in war zones, screams, explosions, the crack of sniper fire, but this hurt deeper. These were Sarah's parents, the grandparents of his kids, and yet their words carved into him like shrapnel. He glanced toward the corner of the room where his 3 children huddled, their small bodies pressed against the wall, like they could disappear into the floral wallpaper. Daniel, 10, with his mother's sharp blue eyes, clutched Emily's hand. At 7, she was all golden curls and trembling lips, her stuffed bunny dangling from one arm. Sam, barely 4, peeked out from behind his sister, his chubby fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. Their fear was a punch to David's gut, worse than any insult. He wanted to scream, to flip the table, and let the crystal glasses shatter, but he stayed silent. Silence had been his shield in the military, through ambushes, through loss, through the day Sarah's cancer won. Now it was all he had to keep from breaking. "Say something, damn it!" Richard snapped, slamming his palm on the table. The kids flinched and Emily let out a small whimper. Daniel whispered, "Don't cry, Em. Dad's got this." His voice was steady, too steady for a kid his age, and it broke David's heart a little more. Catherine finally looked up, her eyes cold as the iced tea sweating on the table. "We've been generous, David. Housing you, feeding those children, it's enough. You're a grown man. Act like one." Her words dripped with disdain, as if his grief, his struggle, his very existence was an inconvenience. David's mind flashed to Sarah, her laugh, her warmth, the way she'd roll her eyes at her mother's snobbery. She'd be furious now, but she'd also beg him to stay calm for the kids. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "I've been trying," he said quietly, his voice rough like gravel. "I've been looking for work, you know that. It was true." He'd sent out resumes, taken odd jobs, construction security, anything to keep the lights on. But the economy was a mess, and a washed-up vet with PTSD and 3 kids wasn't exactly a hot commodity. "Trying isn't enough," Richard barked. "You're a leech, David. You think you can coast on our goodwill forever?" He leaned back, folding his arms like a judge passing sentence. "This ends today. You're out. All of you." The words landed like a grenade, and for a moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. David's pulse pounded in his ears, his vision narrowing like it used to before a mission. Out. Just like that. No discussion, no compromise. He looked at his kids again. Daniel's clenched fists, Emily's wide eyes, Sam's confused frown, and felt the weight of his failure. He'd promised Sarah he'd keep them safe, give them a home, and now he was losing that too. He stood his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Fine," he said, his voice low but steady. "We'll go." He didn't look at Richard or Catherine, couldn't bear to see their smug satisfaction. Instead, he walked to his kids, kneeling to meet their eyes. "Grab your stuff, okay? Just the important things." His voice softened, but it cracked at the edges. Daniel nodded, his face set like a soldier's, and led his siblings upstairs. As they packed, David stood by the window staring at the perfect lawn he'd mowed 100 times. He'd come here after Sarah's death thinking it was a lifeline, a way to give his kids stability. But it was a mirage. Richard and Catherine had never seen him as family, just a burden they tolerated until the numbers didn't add up. He remembered Sarah's warning whispered late one night, "They're not who you think, David. They love control more than they love me." He hadn't believed her then. He did now. The kids returned each with a small backpack. Daniel carried Sam's too, the straps digging into his skinny shoulders. Emily clutched her bunny, her eyes red but dry. Sam, oblivious to the gravity, tugged at David's hand. "Are we going on an adventure, Daddy?" he asked, his voice bright. David forced a smile, his heart twisting. Yeah, buddy, a big adventure. He led them out the front door past the manicured hedges and the gleaming BMW in the driveway. Richard and Catherine didn't follow, didn't say goodbye. The door clicked shut behind them, and David felt it like a gunshot. The sun burned his skin, but inside he was cold, hollowed out by the realization that he was truly alone except for the 3 small souls depending on him. As they walked down the street, the first drops of rain began to fall heavy and unforgiving. David pulled his jacket over Sam's head, shielding him from the downpour. He didn't know where they were going, only that they couldn't stay. Not here, not with people who saw his children as line items on a balance sheet. He'd failed them once today. He wouldn't again. The rain came down in sheets, turning the suburban street into a blur of grey and green. David Stone trudged forward, his boots splashing through puddles, each step heavier than the last. His kids trailed behind him, their small forms hunched against the storm. Daniel 10 gripped his backpack straps like they were lifelines, his jaw set in that stubborn way that reminded David so much of Sarah. Emily 7 clutched her stuffed bunny, its ears now soggy and drooping. Sam, only 4, clung to David's hand, his tiny fingers cold and trembling. The weight of their trust pressed on David's chest, heavier than the rain soaking his clothes. He'd led men through war zones, but this leading his kids into nowhere felt like a mission, with no intel, no backup, no end. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Sam's voice piped up barely audible over the rain's drumbeat. His wide eyes searched David's face, expecting an answer, expecting safety. David's throat tightened. He didn't know. The truth was a knife twisting in his gut. He had no plan, no destination, just a burning need to get away from the Hayes' house, from the venom of Richard and Catherine's words. "Somewhere safe, buddy," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Just keep walking with me, okay?" Daniel glanced up, his blue eyes sharp despite the water streaming down his face. "We're not going back, are we?" It wasn't a question. Not really. The kid was too smart, too observant. He'd seen the way his grandparents looked at them like they were stray dogs cluttering up their perfect lawn. David shook his head. "No, Dan, we're not." The rain stung David's skin, pulling him back to memories he'd fought to bury. Nights in Afghanistan crouched under makeshift shelters, the monsoon turning the ground to mud. He'd been a soldier then, with a purpose, a team. Now he was just a man with 3 kids and a backpack running from a different kind of enemy. The humiliation burned worse than the cold. He'd let Sarah down. He'd let them all down. They'd been walking for 20 minutes, maybe more, when a voice cut through the rain. "David, is that you?" He turned to see Eleanor Vance, the neighbour, from 2 houses down, standing under a dripping awning. Her silver hair was tucked under a scarf and her eyes kind but sharp, took in the scene a soaked father and 3 shivering kids, their backpacks sagging like their spirits. "Good Lord, what are you doing out in this mess?" David's first instinct was to lie to brush it off. He'd been trained to keep his head down to never show weakness. But Eleanor's gaze held no judgment, only concern, and something in him cracked. "We're moving on," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Had to leave the Hayes' place." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line like she knew more than he was saying. "Come inside, all of you. You're soaked to the bone." David hesitated, pride warring with desperation. But Sam was shivering and Emily's teeth were chattering. He nodded, following Eleanor into her small, cosy house. The warmth hit like a wave, wrapping around them as they stepped inside. The living room smelled of lavender and fresh bread, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the Hayes mansion. Eleanor bustled about, grabbing towels and blankets, her movements quick but gentle. "Sit, sit," she said, waving them toward a worn but comfortable couch. "I'll make some tea. Kids, you like hot chocolate?" Sam's face lit up and Emily nodded shyly. Daniel stayed quiet, his eyes scanning the room like he was casing a perimeter. David sank onto the couch, his wet clothes leaving a puddle on the hardwood. Shame clawed at him. He was a grown man, a former soldier reduced to accepting charity from a neighbour. "We're fine, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "Just needed to get out of the rain." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, handing him a towel. "Don't give me that, David Stone. You look like you've been through hell and back." She paused, her voice softening. "What happened over there?" He rubbed the towel over his face, buying time. The truth was too raw, too humiliating. "They didn't want us there anymore," he said finally. "Said we were a burden." The words stung, echoing Richard's accusation. He glanced at his kids now, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot chocolate Eleanor had conjured up. Daniel's eyes met his, and David saw the question there. "Why don't they love us, Dad?" He couldn't answer that, not yet. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Richard and Catherine always did care more about their bank account than their hearts," she said quietly. "Sarah was different. She'd be proud of you, David. You're doing right by those kids." The mention of Sarah was a punch to the chest. David's throat burned and he looked away, focusing on a faded photo on Eleanor's mantel, a younger her with a man in a navy uniform. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promised her I'd keep them safe, but I've got nothing. No job, no home, just them." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "You've got more than you think. You've got those 3 kids and they've got you. That's enough to start." She stood brushing her hands on her apron. "You're staying here tonight. No arguments." David wanted to protest, but exhaustion won out. He nodded, grateful and ashamed all at once. As Eleanor set up a makeshift bed on the couch, David watched his kids. Sam was already half asleep, his head on Emily's shoulder. Emily hugged her bunny, whispering something to it. Daniel sat stiffly, still on guard, but his eyes softened when David reached out to ruffle his hair. That night, as the rain battered the windows, David lay on the floor beside the couch, his kids curled up above him. He stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down. He'd failed them today, let them see the ugliness of rejection, but Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. "You've got them and they've got you." It wasn't much, but it was something. He closed his eyes, whispering a promise into the dark. "I'll fix this, Sarah. For them, for us." The rain kept falling, but for the first time that day, David felt a flicker of resolve. They were down, but they weren't out. Not yet. The rain had stopped, but the night was heavy with the scent of wet earth and lavender lingering in Eleanor Vance's small living room. David Stone lay on the floor, his body aching from the day's weight, his mind a battlefield of guilt and failure. The couch above him creaked as his kids shifted in their sleep. Daniel's soft snores, Emily's murmurs to her bunny, Sam's tiny breaths. Their trust was a lifeline, but also a chain anchoring him to a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He stared at the ceiling, its cracks illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp, filtering through the curtains. Sleep wouldn't come, not tonight. He sat up, careful not to wake the kids, and reached for the battered backpack he'd carried out of the Hayes house. It was Sarah's old pack, army green canvas frayed at the edges, a relic from their early days when they'd hike the Smoky Mountains, laughing about a future they thought was certain. He unzipped it, his fingers brushing over the contents, a few clothes, a toothbrush, a photo of Sarah smiling with the kids at a county fair. His chest tightened. "God, I miss you." He thought the words a silent prayer to a woman who'd never answer. His hand grazed something unfamiliar, a crinkle of paper in the side pocket. Frowning, he pulled out a worn envelope, its edges yellowed and sealed with a faded VA hospital stamp. His name was scrawled across it in a familiar jagged script, Mark Jenkins. The sight of it hit like a rifle recoil. Mark, his best friend, his brother in arms, the man who'd taken a blast for him in Afghanistan, leaving David with nightmares and a debt he could never repay. David's hands trembled as he tore the envelope open, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Inside was a letter folded tight and a small packet of legal documents. He unfolded the letter first, his eyes scanning the words under the dim light of his phone. Mark's handwriting was messy, like he'd written it in a hurry, but every word carried weight, Dave. "If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Don't beat yourself up, that's an order. You've got enough ghosts. I'm leaving you something not because you need a handout, but because I know you'll do right with it." The papers explain the rest. It's a trust 100 million set up through my family's estate. Use it to build something for you, for Sarah, for those kids. For all the guys like us who come back broken and don't know where to start. You always talked about giving back and making a difference. This is your shot. Don't let it slip. You are my brother, man. Keep fighting the good fight. Mark David's breath caught a sob clawing its way up his throat. He pressed a fist to his mouth, stifling it, not wanting to wake the kids. Mark's face flashed in his mind, grinning under a dusty helmet, sharing a cigarette during a rare quiet moment, promising they'd open a bar together someday. A place where vets could feel at home. That dream died with Mark buried under the rubble of a roadside bomb. David had survived, but sometimes he wondered if he'd been the one left behind. He flipped through the documents, his eyes blurring as he read. It was real, a trust fund established years ago managed by a law firm in DC. $100 million. The number was obscene, unreal, like something out of a movie. But it wasn't the money that broke him. It was Mark's faith scrawled in black ink, a belief that David could be more than a grieving widower, more than a father scraping by, and Mark had died for him, and now he'd given him a second chance, a purpose wrapped in paper and sacrifice. David leaned back against the couch, the letter pressed to his chest. Tears streamed down his face, silent but unstoppable. He wasn't crying for the money, he'd never cared about wealth. He cried for Mark, for the brother who'd seen something in him worth saving. He cried for Sarah, who'd believed in him even when he doubted himself. And he cried for his kids who deserved a father who could rise above the ashes of his failures. A memory surfaced sharp and vivid. A night in Kabul, the air thick with dust and tension. He and Mark were crouched in a bombed-out building waiting for dawn. Mark had talked about his family's wealth, how it never felt like his. "If I make it out, I'm doing something real with it," he'd said, his voice low but fierce. "Something for guys like us who come back and can't find their place." David had nodded, thinking it was just talk, the kind of dream soldiers spin to survive the dark, but Mark had meant it. This trust was his final mission, and he'd entrusted it to David. He wiped his eyes, glancing at his kids. Daniel's arm was slung protectively over Emily, who clutched her bunny like a shield. Sam's tiny hand hung off the couch inches from David's shoulder. They were his reason, his mission now, but Mark's letter had lit a spark, a reminder that he wasn't just fighting for them, he was fighting for every soldier who had come home to a world that didn't understand their scars. Eleanor's words from earlier echoed in his head. "You've got me more than you..." Maybe she was right. Maybe this was his chance to prove it. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope with the documents. His mind raced, piecing together a plan. The money wasn't a fix for everything, it couldn't bring Sarah back, couldn't erase the sting of Richard and Catherine's rejection. But it was a tool, a weapon to build something new, something worthy of Mark's sacrifice. He stood moving to the window. The street outside was quiet, the rain-soaked pavement glinting under streetlights. For the first time in months, David felt a flicker of purpose, fragile but real. He thought of Sarah's smile, of Mark's laugh, of the kids sleeping behind him. "I won't let you down," he whispered to all of them. Mark, Sarah, the kids himself. The words felt like a vow carved into the dark. He returned to the floor, lying beside the couch, the envelope clutched in his hand. Sleep still wouldn't come, but it didn't matter. For the first time that day, David wasn't running from something. He was moving toward it, a promise, a purpose, a chance to rebuild. The weight of the past was still there, heavy and unyielding, but now there was something else, hope small and stubborn, like a seed in cracked earth. David Stone woke to the smell of coffee and the soft clatter of dishes in Eleanor Vance's kitchen. The morning light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the hardwood floor. His kids were still asleep on the couch, tangled in blankets, their faces peaceful in a way that made his chest ache. For a moment he just watched them. Daniel's arm slung over Emily Sam's tiny hand, clutching a corner of her bunny. They were his world, and yesterday he'd almost lost them to the cruelty of a world that didn't care. But Mark's letter, tucked safely in the backpack at his feet, had shifted something inside him. It wasn't just money. It was a mission, a second chance to be the man Sarah believed in, the man Mark died for. He stood stretching the stiffness from his back and slipped into the kitchen. Eleanor was at the stove, flipping pancakes, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. "Morning," she said, without turning her voice, warm but no nonsense. "Coffee's on the counter. You look like you need it." David managed a half smile, pouring himself a mug. The warmth of the ceramic grounded him, a small anchor in the chaos of the last 24 hours. "Thanks, Eleanor. For everything." His voice was rough, still raw from the night's emotions. He sat at the small table, the envelope from Mark burning a hole in his thoughts. Eleanor slid a plate of pancakes in front of him, her eyes sharp as she studied his face. "You found something last night, didn't you? Something big." It wasn't a question. She had a way of seeing through people, like she could read the scars beneath their skin. David hesitated, then pulled the envelope from the backpack and slid it across the table. "It's from a friend, a brother, really. He left me something." He didn't say the number. $100 million sounded absurd even in his head, but he summarized the letter, Mark's words, the trust. Eleanor listened, her hand still, her face unreadable, until he finished. "Well, damn," she said finally. "That's one hell of a legacy." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "So what are you going to do with it? Buy a yacht? Run off to some island?" David snorted, the first real laugh he'd felt in days. "Not my style." He took a sip of coffee, the bitterness steadying him. Mark wanted it to mean something. For guys like us vets who come back and can't find their footing, I'm thinking, a foundation, something to help them, their families, a place to start over. Eleanor's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. That's a tall order, David. You sure you're ready for it? You've got 3 kids and a whole lot of hurt to carry. He looked toward the living room where Sam was stirring, rubbing his eyes. I'm not ready, he admitted. But I don't have a choice. I promised Sarah I'd keep them safe. And Mark, he gave his life for me. I can't waste this. Eleanor nodded like she'd expected nothing less. Then you'd better get moving. Money like that doesn't sit quiet. You'll need help, lawyers, advisors, people who know how to make it work. She was right. David spent the morning on Eleanor's ancient laptop, researching, making calls. He reached out to a law firm in DC that handled Mark's trust, confirming the details. The numbers were real, the access immediate. By noon, he'd set up a meeting with a lawyer named Clara Nguyen, a no-nonsense woman who specialized in non-profit setups, and a financial advisor. Tom Bradley, a vet himself who understood the stakes. They agreed to keep the trust anonymous. David didn't want his name tied to it, didn't want the spotlight. This wasn't about him. It was about Mark, about the guys still fighting battles no one could see. By afternoon, David turned his focus to the kids. They couldn't stay at Eleanor's forever, no matter how much he insisted. It was no trouble. He scoured listings for a place to call home, something simple, something theirs. He found it just before dinner, a modest log cabin 20 miles out, nestled by a lake with pines towering overhead. It was no mansion, but it had a porch, a fireplace, and enough room for the kids to run. The price was a drop in the bucket compared to the trust, but David didn't care about that. He wanted a home, not a statement. He drove out to see it, the kids piled into Eleanor's borrowed station wagon. The cabin was weathered, but solid, its windows catching the late afternoon sun. Emily gasped, pointing at the lake. "Can we swim there, Daddy?" Sam bounced in his seat, chanting, "Fish, fish!" Daniel stayed quiet, but his eyes lit up when he saw the tire swing hanging from an oak tree. For the first time in months, David felt like he was giving them something real. That evening back at Eleanor's, David got to work. He sat at the kitchen table sketching out ideas for the foundation. He called it Beacon of Hope, a nod to Mark's belief in second chances in finding light in the dark. The mission was clear housing support community for veterans and their families. No bureaucracy, no judgment, just a hand up. He thought of the guys he'd served with, men and women haunted by memories, struggling with jobs, with rent, with demons that didn't fade. He'd been there, still was some nights. This was for them. The kids wandered in, drawn by the scratch of his pen. "What's that?" Daddy Sam asked, climbing onto his lap. David ruffled his hair, pulling him close. "It's a plan, buddy. Something to help people like me, like Uncle Mark." Daniel leaned over, reading the words scrawled on the paper. "Beacon of Hope," he said softly. "That's cool, Dad." Emily hugged her bunny, smiling. "It sounds like a lighthouse, like in my storybook." David's throat tightened. "Yeah, just like that." He looked at them, his reason for fighting, and felt the spark from Mark's letter flare brighter. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building something that mattered. As the kids settled back on the couch, David glanced at Eleanor, who was watching from the doorway. "You're doing right by them," she said quietly, "and by Mark." He nodded, the weight of the day settling into resolve. The cabin, the foundation, the kids, it was a new war, one he didn't know if he could win. But he'd fought through worse with less. He picked up the pen, the letter from Mark tucked beside him, and kept writing. The fight was just beginning, and for the first time in a long time, David Stone felt ready. The morning sun spilled over the lake, painting the log cabin's porch in hues of gold and amber. David Stone stood there, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching his kids chase each other through the dew-soaked grass. Daniel, now 11, tossed a frisbee with a precision that reminded David of his own military training. Emily 8 giggled as she tried to catch it, her golden curls bouncing. Sam 5 tripped over his own feet but popped back up undeterred, shouting, "I'm gonna get it!" Their laughter was a balm soothing the raw edges of David's heart. The cabin was theirs now, a home bought with Mark's trust, but it was these moments, small, messy, alive, that made it real. Inside the cabin was coming together. David had spent the last 2 weeks hauling furniture, sanding floors, painting walls. He'd kept it simple second-hand couches, a sturdy dining table, bunk beds for the kids, but every nail he drove felt like a promise kept. This was their sanctuary, a place where Daniel could read his science books, Emily could draw her dream worlds, and Sam could build forts out of blankets. But even as he built this life for them, David's mind was on a bigger mission. Beacon of hope, the foundation he'd poured his soul into since finding Mark's letter. The idea had taken shape faster than he'd expected. Clara Nguyen, the lawyer, had set up the non-profit structure, ensuring the trust's anonymity. Tom Bradley, the financial advisor and fellow vet, had mapped out a sustainable plan to fund housing and support programs for veterans. David's vision was clear: no red tape, no pity, just real help for those who'd come back from war, only to find a different kind of battle waiting. He'd started small, identifying abandoned homes in the nearby town of Willow Creek, a place hit hard by factory closures and foreclosures. The houses were ghosts of better days, their windows bordered their yards choked with weeds. David saw potential where others saw ruin. Today was the first day of work. David pulled on his work boots, the same ones he'd worn on construction jobs, and loaded a toolbox into the bed of his pickup. The kids piled in excited for the adventure he'd promised. "Are we building houses?" Daddy Sam asked, his eyes wide, as he bounced in the back seat. "Something like that," David said, catching Daniel's curious glance in the rearview mirror. "We're fixing them up, making homes for people who need them." The first house was a sagging ranch style on the edge of town, its paint peeling like old skin. David met a small crew there, volunteers he'd recruited through Tom's veteran networks. There was Mike, a burly ex-Marine with a limp and a quick laugh. Lisa, a former army medic who spoke in clipped sentences but worked like a machine. And Javier, a quiet Navy vet who had lost his home to medical bills. They weren't just workers, they were the reason David was doing this. He felt it in his bones. Mark's trust wasn't just money, it was a debt to men and women like these. David didn't stand on ceremony. He grabbed a hammer and got to work, tearing out rotted drywall alongside the crew. The air filled with dust and the rhythmic thud of tools, a sound that grounded him like the cadence of a march. The kids helped where they could. Daniel hauled debris to a dumpster, his skinny arms straining but determined. Emily handed out water bottles, her bunny tucked under one arm. Sam supervised mostly by drawing stick figures in the dust on the windows. Their presence was a reminder of why this mattered. By noon the house was gutted, its bones exposed but salvageable. David wiped sweat from his brow, his shirt sticking to his back. Mike clapped him on the shoulder. "You're not half bad at this, Stone," he said, grinning. "Thought you officer types just gave orders." David chuckled, the sound rusty but real. "Been a while since I gave orders. Just trying to keep up." He glanced at the house, imagining it whole again, a kitchen where a family could eat, a bedroom where a vet could sleep without nightmares. It wasn't just about fixing walls, it was about rebuilding lives. Word of Beacon of Hope spread faster than David expected. By the second week, more volunteers showed up. Locals, church groups, even a few high school kids looking for service hours. The community centre became a hub where they shared potluck dinners and stories. One night, Lisa told the group about her struggle with PTSD, how she'd nearly lost herself to it. This, she said, gesturing to the half-finished house, "This is what keeps me going." Her words hit David hard, echoing his own nights spent staring at the ceiling, fighting shadows only he could see. The real turning point came on a rainy afternoon when Javier pulled David aside. The man's hands were calloused, his eyes haunted. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. "Last month I was ready to end it, had the pills lined up. Then I heard about this project. Gave me a reason to get up." He paused, swallowing hard. "You saved me, man." David's throat closed up. He wanted to say it wasn't him, it was Mark, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he gripped Javier's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement. That night he sat on the cabin's porch, the lake shimmering under the moon. He thought of Mark, of the promise scrawled in that letter. Do something real. He was trying, but it felt bigger than him, like he was carrying a torch he didn't deserve. Daniel joined him, sitting cross-legged with a book in his lap. "Dad," he said, "I helped fix a window today. Mike said I did good." His voice held a quiet pride, and David's heart swelled. His son wasn't just surviving, he was growing, finding purpose in the work. "You did great, Dan," David said, ruffling his hair. "I'm proud of you." He looked out at the lake, the water reflecting the stars. Beacon of Hope wasn't just about veterans. It was about his kids too, about showing them what it meant to build something to give back. He stayed anonymous, letting the work speak for itself, but Daniel's small acts of help were becoming a symbol to the crew, a reminder that hope could start young. As the days turned into weeks, the first house took shape: new roof, fresh paint, a porch where a family could sit. David watched from the sidelines, hammer in hand, as the crew celebrated small victories. He thought of Sarah, how she'd smile at this, how she'd tell him to keep going. The work was hard, the days long, but for the first time since her death, David felt like he was moving forward. The houses weren't just structures, they were lifelines, proof that broken things could be made whole again. The late afternoon sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the half-finished frame of the second house in the Beacon of Hope project. David Stone leaned against his pickup, his flannel shirt damp with sweat, watching the crew pack up for the day. The air smelled of sawdust and fresh paint, a reminder of progress, of purpose. Daniel was hauling a stack of plywood with Mike the ex-Marine, both of them laughing at some shared joke. Emily sat on a crate sketching the house in her notebook, her bunny propped beside her. Sam, ever the whirlwind, darted around helping, by handing out tools that no one needed. For a moment David let himself breathe. This was what he'd fought for, a life where his kids could smile, where broken things could be rebuilt. His phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the calm. It was Eleanor Vance, her name on the screen, sending a prickle of unease down his spine. "David," she said when he answered, her voice low, urgent. "You need to know. Richard and Catherine are back in town. They've been asking around, looking for you." David's grip tightened on the phone. The names hit like a sucker punch, dragging him back to that rain-soaked day when he'd walked out of their pristine suburban fortress with his kids in tow. He'd thought that chapter was closed, sealed shut by their cold dismissal. "What do they want?" he asked, his voice rough, already dreading the answer. Eleanor hesitated, and he could picture her in her cozy kitchen, choosing her words carefully. "They didn't say much, but they don't look good, David. Rough around the edges, like life's caught up with them. They stopped by my place asking where you went. I didn't tell them anything, but, yeah, you should be ready." He thanked her, his mind already racing. Richard and Catherine Hayes, with their polished surfaces and calculating hearts, didn't just stop by for no reason. He glanced at his kids, still caught up in their small joys, and felt a protective instinct flare. Whatever the Hayes wanted, he wouldn't let it touch them, not again. That evening, David arranged to meet Richard and Catherine at a quiet diner on the edge of town, a place with chipped mugs and vinyl booths that smelled faintly of grease and coffee. He left the kids with their Liebchen, ignoring Daniel's curious questions and Sam's insistence on coming along. It's grown-up stuff, he'd told them, forcing a smile. "I'll be back before bedtime." But as he drove, the weight of the past settled over him like a fog. He remembered Sarah's warnings about her parents, how their love came with strings, how they'd always seen him as a charity case, not a son-in-law. The diner was half empty when he arrived. Richard and Catherine sat in a corner booth, their designer clothes replaced by wrinkled jackets and tired expressions. Richard's silver hair was thinning, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Catherine's makeup couldn't hide the shadows under her eyes, and her hands fidgeted with a paper napkin, tearing it into strips. They looked diminished, like ghosts of the imperious couple who'd thrown him out. David slid into the booth across from them, his posture rigid, his eyes steady. "What do you want?" he asked, cutting through any pretense. Richard cleared his throat, his usual bluster muted. "David, we've been thinking about what happened, about you and the kids." His voice was strained, like it hurt to say the words. "We were too harsh. We see that now." Catherine nodded, her lips tight. "It was a difficult time for us," she said, her tone practiced like she'd rehearsed this. "The business was struggling and we weren't ourselves. But we're family, David. We want to make things right." David's jaw clenched. Family. The word felt like a blade twisted by their betrayal. He remembered Emily's trembling lip, Daniel's clenched fists, Sam's confused eyes as they'd walked into the rain. "Make things right," he repeated, his voice low. "Dangerous. You called my kids a burden. You threw us out like trash. That's not family." Richard flinched, but Catherine leaned forward, her eyes glinting with something desperate. "We took you in, David. For months. We fed you, housed you. That wasn't nothing." She paused, her voice dropping. "We're not asking for much, just compensation. For the time you were with us. A fair amount considering what we gave." The words landed like a grenade, and David's blood ran cold. Compensation. They weren't here to apologize, they were here to bargain. He leaned back, studying them, seeing the truth in their tired faces. They weren't just down on their luck, they were drowning. He'd heard rumors through Eleanor, bad investments of failing business debts piling up. This wasn't about family, it was about survival, and they thought he was their lifeline. "You think I owe you?" he said, his voice steady but laced with steel. "For what, putting a roof over our heads while you counted the cost every day? You didn't give us a home, you gave us a cage." He stood ready to walk away, but a noise at the door stopped him. Daniel stood there, his face pale, Emily and Sam behind him. They'd followed him, probably sneaking out of Eleanor's house driven by curiosity or worry. Daniel's eyes were hard fixed on his grandparents. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the diner's hum. "You didn't want us." Catherine's face crumpled, but Richard tried to recover, his voice softening. "Daniel, we're your grandparents. We care about you. We need to work things out with your dad." Emily stepped forward, clutching her bunny, her voice small but clear. "You made Daddy sad. You made us leave." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a slightly squashed cookie wrapped in a napkin. "I made this for people who are sad. Maybe it'll help you." She set it on the table, her eyes wide and earnest. Sam, oblivious to the tension, piped up. "You can come to our new house. It's by a lake and we're fixing houses for people who need them." His innocence was a stark contrast to the greed in the air, and it hit David like a wave. Richard and Catherine stared at the cookie, at Sam's bright smile, at Daniel's unyielding gaze. For a moment they were speechless, their carefully constructed facade cracking. David felt a surge of pride for his kids, their strength shining through in ways he hadn't expected. He stepped between them, and the haze, his voice firm. "We're done here. Don't come near us again." He led the kids out, their small hands in his, the diner door swinging shut behind them. The night air was cool, the stars sharp above. David's heart pounded, not with anger, but with clarity. Richard and Catherine were the past, a weight he wouldn't carry anymore. His kids' beacon of hope, the life he was building that was his future. As they climbed into the truck, Daniel looked at him. "You okay, Dad?" David nodded, managing a smile. "Yeah, Dan. I'm okay, let's go home." He started the engine, the road ahead stretching into the dark, but for the first time it didn't feel like running. It felt like moving forward. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the cracked vinyl booth where David Stone faced Richard and Catherine Hayes. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and grease, but the real weight came from the words still hanging between them. Compensation, a cold transaction dressed up as family. David's hands clenched under the table, his knuckles white, his heart a drumbeat of anger and betrayal. He'd been ready to walk away to sever the last thread tying him to Sarah's parents when his kids appeared at the door, their small figures framed against the night. Daniel's hard stare, Emily's tentative offering of a cookie, Sam's innocent invitation, they'd stopped him in his tracks, their presence a reminder of what he was fighting for. But the confrontation wasn't over, and David felt the tension coiling tighter like a spring about to snap. Daniel stepped forward, his 11-year-old frame rigid with a defiance that made David's chest ache. The boy's blue eyes, so like Sarah's, locked onto Richard and Catherine with an intensity that belied his age. "You didn't want us," he said again, his voice steady, but laced with hurt. "You told us to leave, you said we were a problem." The words cut through the diner's hum, sharp and unyielding, and David saw Catherine flinch, her manicured nails digging into the napkin she'd shredded. Richard tried to recover his voice, taking on the patronizing tone he used in boardrooms. "Daniel, you're young, you don't understand. We were under a lot of pressure, business finances. We didn't mean to hurt you." He leaned forward, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. "We're here now, aren't we? We want to be part of your lives." David's blood boiled at the lie, but before he could speak, Emily moved closer, her stuffed bunny dangling from one hand. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "You made Daddy sad," she said, her eyes wide and glistening. "You made us feel like we weren't good enough." She set the crumpled cookie on the table, her small fingers trembling. "I made this for people who are sad, so maybe it'll help you feel better." The gesture was so pure, so unguarded, that it felt like a spotlight on Richard and Catherine's shame. Sam, oblivious to the undercurrents, bounced on his toes, his voice bright as he tugged at David's sleeve. "Yeah, and you can come see our new house. It's got a lake, and we're fixing houses for people who don't have one." His grin was wide, his innocence a stark contrast to the greed and manipulation sitting across the table. David's throat tightened, pride and pain warring inside him. His kids weren't just standing up to their grandparents, they were dismantling their facade with the kind of truth only children could wield. Catherine's face crumpled, her composure cracking like thin ice. She reached for the cookie but stopped short, her hand hovering as if she didn't deserve to touch it. Richard's mouth opened, then closed, his usual bluster deflated. For a moment they were just two people stripped of their wealth and status, confronted by the raw honesty of the children they'd discarded. David watched them, his anger tempered by a flicker of pity. They were broken not just financially, but morally grasping at a lifeline they'd burned months ago. He stood placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder, the other resting lightly on Emily's head. "You don't get it," he said, his voice low but steady, cutting through the silence. "Family isn't something you put a price on. It's not a ledger you balance. You had a chance to be there for us for Sarah's kids and you chose yourselves." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You don't get to come back now and act like it was a misunderstanding. You don't get to demand anything." Daniel looked up at him, his eyes fierce with approval, and David felt a surge of strength. His son was watching, learning, and David knew this moment would shape him just as it was shaping David's own resolve. He turned to the kids, softening his tone. "Come on, guys, let's go home." Catherine's voice broke through, small and desperate. "David, please, we're in trouble. The business is gone. We've lost everything." Her eyes were wet, her hands twisting the napkin into knots. "We just need a little help for old time's sake." David stopped his back to them, the words hitting like a distant echo of his own desperation months ago. He remembered the rain, the weight of his kids' trust, the humiliation of being cast out. Part of him wanted to turn to throw their cruelty back in their faces, to let them drown in their own mess. But another part, Sarah's part, the part that still believed in second chances, held him back. He thought of her voice late at night, whispering, "Don't let anyone kill the good in you, David." He wanted to God help him, he wanted to walk away, but he couldn't. Not yet. He turned his face hard, but not cruel. "You want help, earn it. Not with money, not with words, with actions. I'm building something, beacon of hope. It's for people who've been through hell and need a way out. If you want to be part of that, you show up and work. No handouts, no games." He looked at his kids, their faces a mix of confusion and trust, and added, "But you stay away from them until I say otherwise. They've been hurt enough." Richard's face reddened, his pride rearing up, but Catherine grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "We'll think about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded once, then guided his kids out into the night. The drive back to the cabin was quiet, the kids' energy spent. Sam curled up against Emily, already half asleep. Daniel stared out the window, his voice soft when he finally spoke. "They didn't mean it, did they? About being family?" David's hands tightened on the wheel. "I don't know, Dan. Sometimes people say things they think they mean, but it's not the truth. Family's about showing up, not just saying the right words." He glanced at his son, seeing the weight of the question in his eyes. "You guys, you're my family. That's what matters." Emily reached forward, her small hand touching his shoulder. "You're not sad anymore, are you, Daddy?" Her voice was hopeful, and it broke something open in David's chest. "No, Em," he said, managing a smile. "Not anymore." He pulled into the cabin's driveway, the lake glinting under the moonlight. The kids tumbled out their chatter, filling the air as they ran inside. David lingered, staring at the stars. Richard and Catherine were a shadow from the past, but his kids' words had been a light cutting through the dark. They'd reminded him what he was fighting for, not just a home, but a legacy of love and resilience. He stepped inside the warmth of the cabin, wrapping around him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The autumn chill had settled over Willow Creek, the lake outside David Stone's cabin, reflecting a sky streaked with orange and grey. He stood on the porch, his breath visible in the crisp air, watching Daniel and Emily kick a soccer ball across the yard, while Sam cheered, his small fists pumping like he was at a World Cup final. The sight of their laughter, their ease, was a hard-won victory, a reminder of the home he'd built from the ashes of rejection. Beacon of Hope was thriving too. 3 houses, restored families, moving in veterans, finding purpose in the work. David felt the stirrings of pride, but it was tempered by the weight of the past, a shadow that refused to fade. Inside the cabin was warm, filled with the smell of chili simmering on the stove. David was setting the table when his phone buzzed, Eleanor Vance's name flashing on the screen. Her voice when he answered was heavy with something he couldn't quite place. "David, you need to hear this," she said, skipping pleasantries. "It's about Richard and Catherine. Things have gotten bad, real bad." David's stomach tightened, the names dragging him back to the diner, to the sting of their greed disguised as reconciliation. He stepped onto the porch, closing the door to keep the kids from overhearing. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low, bracing for the answer. Eleanor sighed, the sound carrying years of small-town wisdom. "Richard's business collapsed, completely. Word around town is he made some bad calls, invested in a shady real estate deal that went south. They're bankrupt, David. The house has gone auctioned off to cover debts. Catherine's been selling her jewellery just to pay for groceries. They're living out of a motel now, the one by the highway." The news hit like a distant explosion, the shockwave rippling through him. David leaned against the porch railing, his mind flashing to the Hayes' pristine mansion, its manicured lawn and crystal chandeliers. He could still hear Richard's booming voice calling his family a bottomless pit, see Catherine's cold stare as she demanded compensation. They'd been untouchable then, or so they thought. Now they were broken, stripped of the wealth they'd worn like armour. Part of him, the part that still carried the sting of their betrayal, felt a flicker of satisfaction, a dark whisper of justice. But it was fleeting, drowned out by a deeper, more troubling feeling, pity. David Eleanor's voice pulled him back. "You still there?" "Yeah," he said, rubbing a hand over his face. "Just processing." He paused, the question heavy on his tongue. "How bad is it, really bad?" she said bluntly. "I saw Richard at the gas station last week. Looked like he hadn't slept in days, just sitting in his car, staring at nothing. Catherine's not much better. Folks say she's been crying in public, something nobody ever thought they'd see. They're not just broke, David. They're lost." He thanked Eleanor and hung up the phone, heavy in his hand. The kids' laughter drifted from the yard, a stark contrast to the weight settling in his chest. He should have felt vindicated. Richard and Catherine had reaped what they'd sown. They'd thrown him and his kids out, reduced Sarah's memory to a line item in their ledger. But instead of triumph, David felt a gnawing unease, a tug at the edges of his conscience. He thought of Sarah, her voice soft in his memory. "Don't let anyone douse the good in you, David." She'd said it during one of their last nights together, her hand weak but warm in his. She'd known her parents' flaws, but she'd loved them, hoped for them, even when they didn't deserve it. He went inside, stirring the chili absent-mindedly, his mind churning. The kids burst in their cheeks, flushed from the cold. "Dinner smells awesome, Dad," Sam declared, climbing onto a chair. Emily set her sketchbook on the table, a drawing of the lake glowing under her crayons. Daniel, always the observer, studied David's face. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. David forced a smile, shaking his head. "Just thinking, Dan. Let's eat." But as they sat passing bowls and trading stories about the day, David's thoughts kept drifting to Richard and Catherine. He saw them in his mind's eye, Richard, once a titan, now slumped in a motel room. Catherine, her elegance traded for desperation. They weren't just people who'd hurt him. They were Sarah's parents, the grandparents his kids barely knew. That connection frayed as it was gnawed at him. Later, after the kids were in bed, David sat by the fireplace, the crackle of the logs, a soft counterpoint to his restless thoughts. He pulled out Mark's letter, the paper worn from handling, and read it again. Do something real. Beacon of hope was that something houses, rebuilt lives, restored. But what about the people who'd fallen not from war, but from their own mistakes? Did they deserve a chance too? He thought of Javier, the Navy vet who'd stood on the edge of despair until the project gave him purpose. If David could offer that to a stranger, could he turn his back on Sarah's parents? He wrestled with it, the firelight dancing across the cabin's walls. Helping Richard and Catherine felt like betraying his kids, like forgiving the unforgivable. But letting them sink felt like betraying Sarah, betraying the part of him that still believed in redemption. He remembered a night in Afghanistan, pinned down by gunfire, Mark at his side. "We don't leave men behind," Mark had said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Not even the ones who screw up." David had lived by that code then. Could he live by it now? He stood pacing the small living room, the weight of the decision pressing down. He could walk away, let Richard and Catherine face the consequences of their choices. No one would blame him, not Eleanor, not his kids, not even himself. But Sarah's voice echoed again, stubborn and clear. "Don't let them win by making you hard." He stopped, his eyes falling on a photo on the mantel, Sarah and the kids at the beach, her smile bright even as the cancer was stealing her strength. She'd want him to try, not for her parents' sake, but for his own, for the man she'd loved. David sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. He didn't have an answer, not yet, but the seed of a plan was forming, something that honoured both his anger and his compassion. Beacon of Hope was about second chances for veterans, for families, maybe even for people like Richard and Catherine. He'd need to set boundaries, protect his kids, but he couldn't turn away completely, not without trying. He looked out the window, the lake a dark mirror under the stars, and made a silent promise to Sarah, to himself. He'd face this not out of weakness but strength. The past was knocking and he'd answer, but on his terms. The wind howled outside the cabin, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the cracks in the walls. David Stone sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of a single lamp casting shadows across the papers spread before him, blueprints for the next Beacon of Hope house budgets, volunteer schedules. But his mind wasn't on the work. It was on Eleanor's call from yesterday, her words about Richard and Catherine's collapse echoing like a warning shot. Bankruptcy, a motel by the highway, Catherine selling her jewellery, Richard, a broken man staring into nothing. The images haunted him, stirring a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, pity, and the stubborn pull of Sarah's memory urging him towards something he wasn't sure he could give. The kids were asleep upstairs, their soft snores drifting down a reminder of what was at stake. David's fingers traced the edge of Mark's letter tucked beside the blueprints, its words a steady drumbeat in his head. Do something real. He'd built a home for his kids, started a foundation for veterans, but this felt like a test he hadn't trained for. Helping Sarah's parents, the people who'd thrown them out, felt like walking into a minefield blindfolded. Yet turning away felt like letting the past win, letting their cruelty define him. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Eleanor again, her voice tight with urgency. David, they're here, at my house. Showed up 10 minutes ago, soaked to the bone and looking like they've got nowhere else to go. She paused, and he could hear the strain in her silence. I didn't invite them in, but they're asking for you. What do you want me to do? David's jaw clenched, his pulse kicking up like he was back in a firefight. He glanced at the clock past 9, the kids long asleep. Tell them to meet me at the diner, he said, his voice steady despite the churn in his gut. Same place as before. I'll be there in 20. He hung up, grabbed his jacket and stepped into the night, the rain lashing his face as he drove. The diner's neon sign flickered in the distance, a beacon in the storm, and David braced himself for what was coming. Inside the diner was quieter than last time, the late hour thinning the crowd to a lone trucker at the counter and a waitress wiping down tables. Richard and Catherine sat in the same corner booth, but they were barely recognisable. Richard's suit was rumpled, his silver hair matted from the rain. Catherine's eyes were red-rimmed, her once impeccable makeup smudged her hands, clutching a cheap umbrella like a lifeline. They looked small, fragile, a far cry from the imperious couple who'd once ruled their suburban empire. David slid into the booth, his face a mask of calm he didn't feel. You found me, he said, his tone flat. What do you want? Catherine's voice cracked as she spoke the words, spilling out in a rush. David, we're sorry. Truly. We've lost everything, the house, the business, our savings. We're living in a motel, barely scraping by. Her hands twisted the umbrella's handle, her eyes pleading. We need help, please. Richard nodded, his voice hoarse. We know we messed up, we were wrong to push you out. But we're family, David. Doesn't that mean something? His eyes, once sharp with disdain, were dull, now heavy with defeat. David leaned back, studying them. Their desperation was real, but so was his memory of their cruelty, calling his kids a burden, demanding compensation like love was a transaction. He thought of Sarah, her gentle insistence on second chances, but also of Daniel's hard stare, Emily's trembling cookie, Sam's innocent trust. He couldn't let them near his kids, not yet. But he couldn't turn away completely either. Not if he wanted to be the man Sarah believed in. I'm not giving you money, he said, finally, his voice low but firm. That's not how this works. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket, a contract he'd drafted with Clara Nguyen's help, a contingency he'd hoped he wouldn't need. He slid it across the towel. Beacon of Hope needs workers. You want help, you earn it. Sign this. You'll work full-time for a year, cleaning building, whatever needs doing. No special treatment. In return, I'll cover your debts, get you a place to stay, but you don't come near my kids until I say so. Richard's face darkened, his pride flaring. Work, he sputtered. You expect us to swing hammers, scrub floors? We're not labourers, David. His voice rose, drawing the waitress's glance. But Catherine grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. Richard, stop, she whispered, her voice breaking. We don't have a choice. She looked at David. Her expression a mix of shame and desperation. We'll do it. We'll sign. David held her gaze, searching for sincerity. He saw it buried beneath layers of pride and regret, but it was there. Richard's shoulders slumped, his fight draining away. He took the pen David offered his hand, shaking as he signed, followed by Catherine. The act felt final, like a truce in a war no one had won. This isn't forgiveness, David said, folding the contract. It's a chance. You want to be family again, you prove it. Not with words, with work. He stood, his eyes lingering on them. Start tomorrow, 7 a.m. at the site on Maple Street. Don't be late. He walked out, the rain soaking him again, but he barely felt it. His heart was a tangle of relief and unease. He'd done what Sarah would have wanted, offered a lifeline to people who didn't deserve it. But it wasn't for them, it was for her, for the kids, for the part of him that still believed in redemption. He thought of Mark's letter, do something real, and wondered if this was what he'd meant. Not just building houses, but building bridges, even ones that felt like they might collapse. Back at the cabin, David checked on the kids, their sleeping forms a quiet anchor. He sat by the fire, the contract on the table, its ink still fresh. He didn't trust Richard and Catherine, not yet, but he trusted himself to protect his family. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the world outside softening, and David felt a fragile hope take root. This agreement was a gamble, a tightrope walk between justice and mercy, but he'd walked tighter ropes before in places darker than this. He'd make it work for his kids, for Sarah, for the man he was still becoming. The early morning mist hung low over Willow Creek, curling around the half-built frame of the latest Beacon of Hope house like a ghost. David Stone stood at the edge of the site, his breath visible in the chill, his work boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled of pine and wet dirt, a reminder of the raw, honest work ahead. His crew was already moving, Mike the ex-Marine hauling lumber, Lisa the former medic organising tools with her usual precision. But today was different. Today Richard and Catherine Hayes would join them, their signatures on David's contract binding them to a year of labour in exchange for a lifeline. He didn't know if he was ready for this, but the decision was made driven by Sarah's memory and a stubborn belief that even the worst could change. David sipped coffee from a thermos, his eyes scanning the site. He'd been up half the night wrestling with the choice to let Richard and Catherine into his world again. The diner confrontation had been a gamble, their desperate agreement a fragile thread. He didn't trust them, not yet, but he trusted himself to keep his kids safe, to hold the line. The contract was clear, no special treatment, no access to Daniel, Emily or Sam, until they'd proven themselves. This wasn't forgiveness, it was a test. The crunch of gravel announced their arrival. Richard's old sedan pulled up, its paint chipped, a far cry from the BMW that once gleamed in their driveway. Richard stepped out first, his face haggard, his suit jacket replaced by a cheap windbreaker. Catherine followed, her scarf pulled tight, her eyes darting nervously. They looked out of place like actors in the wrong scene, and David felt a pang of something he couldn't name, pity maybe, or the ghost of Sarah's hope. "Morning." David said, his voice neutral, pointing to a pile of tools. "You're on clean-up today. Debris goes in the dumpster, floors need sweeping. Mike'll show you the ropes." He kept it short, no warmth, no hostility, just the job. Richard's jaw tightened, his pride flaring like a dying ember. "Clean up," he muttered, his voice low but sharp. "I ran a company, David. I'm not a janitor." Catherine nudged him, her eyes pleading, but he shook her off his hands, balling into fists. David met his gaze, unflinching. "You signed the contract. Everyone starts somewhere. You want to eat, you work." He turned away, signalling the conversation was over, but he felt Richard's stare boring into his back. This wasn't going to be easy. The morning unfolded in fits and starts. Richard wielded a broom like it was an insult, his movements stiff, his complaints a constant undercurrent. "This is ridiculous," he grumbled, shoving debris into a pile. "I'm 62 years old, not some labourer." Catherine was quieter, her hands clumsy as she sorted nails, her face flushed with embarrassment. The crew watched them warily, sensing the tension but keeping their distance. David stayed focused, hammering studs into place, but he kept an eye on them, gauging their commitment. By noon, Richard was red-faced, his hands blistered from the broom. He dropped it, storming to the edge of the site. "This is humiliating," he snapped loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you can break me, David? Parade me around like some charity case." David set his hammer down, wiping sweat from his brow. He walked over, his voice low but firm. "Nobody's parading you, Richard. You're here because you asked for help. You want out, there's the road." He pointed to the sedan, his eyes hard. "But you walk away, you're on your own." Richard glared, his chest heaving, but before he could retort, Mike stepped in, his limp pronounced from the morning's work. "You think this is humiliating," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "Try coming home from Fallujah with half your leg gone, no job, no place to sleep. This work, its purpose, its pride. You're not better than it." His words hung heavy and Richard's face fell, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Mike's truth. Catherine touched Richard's arm, her voice soft. "He's right, Richard. We need this." She looked at David, her eyes pleading for patience. "We'll keep going." The afternoon was quieter. Richard's complaints reduced to muttered curses. David watched them from a distance, his heart a tangle of frustration and hope. He didn't want them here, not really, but he couldn't shake Sarah's voice. Don't let them kill the good in you. He threw himself into the work, hoping it would drown out the noise in his head. The turning point came late in the day when Sam showed up unexpectedly, dropped off by Eleanor for a quick visit. The 5-year-old bounded onto the site, his backpack bouncing, a grin splitting his face. "Daddy, I brought my truck stickers," he announced, holding up a sheet of colourful decals. Before David could steer him away, Sam spotted Richard, who was nursing a splinter on his finger. Without hesitation, Sam ran over, peeling off a sticker shaped like a red fire truck. "Here, Grandpa," he said, sticking it on Richard's hand. "This'll make it better. You're building cool stuff." Richard froze the sticker absurdly bright against his weathered skin. His eyes met Sam's, and for a moment something softened in his face, a crack in the armour of his pride. "Thanks, kid," he muttered, his voice rough, but not unkind. David watched, his chest tight torn between wanting to pull Sam away and letting the moment unfold. Sam's innocence was a weapon disarming in its purity, and David saw the impact in Richard's slumped shoulders. Catherine's transformation was slower but no less profound. She had been assigned to the community centre's kitchen, helping prepare meals for the crew. Her first attempt at cornbread was a disaster, burnt edges raw centre a mess that left her near tears. "I'm useless at this," she whispered, scrubbing a pan with shaking hands. Lisa the medic overheard and sat beside her, her own hands scarred from years of service. "You think I knew how to do this when I started?" she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I was a soldier, not a cook, but I learned. You will too. It's not about the food, it's about showing up." Catherine looked at her eyes wide and nodded. Later, when Daniel stopped by to drop off a tool, he saw her stirring a pot of stew, her movements still awkward but determined. "You're different now," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "You're more like family." The words were simple, but they hit Catherine like a wave, her eyes glistening as she turned away to hide her tears. A small incident sealed the shift. Richard, still grumbling, was carrying a stack of boards when one slipped, nearly pinning Mike under its weight. Without thinking, Richard lunged, catching it just in time. The crew clapped, a rare moment of camaraderie, and Mike gripped his shoulder. "Good save, man. You're one of us now." Richard's face flushed, not with anger, but with something new, pride, raw and unfamiliar. That night, David sat on the cabin's porch, the lake a dark mirror under the stars. The kids were asleep, the day's work heavy in his bones. Richard and Catherine were changing slowly, their pride giving way to something humbler. Sam's sticker. Daniel's words, Lisa's encouragement. They were small moments, but they were building something. David didn't know if it was redemption, not yet, but it was a start. He thought of Sarah, her belief in second chances, and felt her presence in the quiet. This was his fight now, not just for his kids, not just for veterans, but for the idea that even the broken could be made whole again.